Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session here we're going to have today on the United States Institute of Peace training of peacekeepers, as well as with our guest, the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, and their work on peacekeeper training. We're going to have a great conversation today about the evolution of peacekeeper training, both how it's evolved over time since the introduction of peacekeeping and where it should go into the future to face the new challenges we have today and the needs and the lessons learned we've learned through over the decades of peacekeeper training. Before we welcome our distinguished participants in this conversation, I just want to introduce a little bit about how peacekeeper training is so important to USIP, the United States Institute of Peace's mandate and mission. We have a mission here or mandate from Congress to prevent, mitigate, and resolve violent conflict. And peacekeeper training is a crucial part of that work. We have been working since 2008 on conflict management training for peacekeepers, and we've worked to train both UN peacekeepers and other peacekeepers headed off to peacekeeping missions. And it's an essential part of how we work to not only help communities, help peacekeepers when they're deployed, both military and civilian peacekeepers, to work in engaging with communities and help the the side of peacekeeper training that brings communities together and both links peacekeepers and communities. It's an important part of how we help the management of conflict, both during active conflicts and in a post-conflict situation. But it strikes me, my own experience in the UN, I never really worked too long in peacekeeping, but I had a brief stint in Somalia, embedded with the African Union in their civil affairs department, and worked at the AMISOM mission there with some of the different troop contributing countries. And what really struck me is that I won't name any countries in particular, but there was a range in the training that was quite obvious. And I know that the UN has its standard training modules and the standard training curriculum that it requires pre-deployment, but there's often other training that can be helpful. And I think it's important that peacekeepers, when deployed, have all the tools that they need to both, fulfill their mandate, but also ensure that they themselves are behaving in a way that is responsible and responsive to the needs of the communities that they work in. So I hope we can talk more about that today. The other little anecdote I will talk about from my own experience, and you're not going to hear from me, you'll hear from our participants. But when I first began in 2010 in the UN legal department, one of the issues I was working on in New York was the cholera outbreak in Haiti, which was allegedly, I think, later proven to be attributed to the Nepalese contingent there. And it was, there were issues of whether or not who was responsible, was there any negligence, where was the liability? But regardless of fault and where that landed and how communities were compensated, it was part of a long legacy of sort of unfortunate and negative experiences the Haitian community had with the various peacekeepers that were deployed there to the stabilization mission. And we had a meeting just recently, yesterday actually, with some UN personnel, high-level UN personnel working on Haiti, and now the situation is very dire and desperate, and there's a need for some sort of force to do an intervention, and we can't find a resolution. They're trying to find a non-UN solution. Maybe they're going to go back and try to find some UN solution that's acceptable to the Haitian people. But what we all know what is needed is some sort of hopeful support to Haiti and the Haitian people to help stop the violence of the gangs in Port-au-Prince, but also elsewhere. And so it just speaks to this conversation, I think, the need to evolve, to learn, to have good training and good implementation of peacekeeping. And I really look forward to that conversation. before the last thing I'll introduce, I'll say before we introduce our guests is here at USIP, we also like to, when looking forward, look back to some of the positive lessons learned and when possible, the American contributions to that. And so I was reading this morning in preparation today about Ralph Bunche. And I think Ralph Bunche is an American hero, Nobel laureate that is too often overlooked. He's an African-American who was a professor at Howard and was largely accredited to being one of the fathers of peacekeeping. He helped create the first peacekeeping force that went in 1948 to the UN Truce Supervision or organization, I think UNSO, which is still there today in Jerusalem after the Arab-Israeli War. And then he was a major architect of the UNEF after the Suez Crisis. And he's a champion, a real American hero, and he's often overlooked, I think, too much here in the United States. So he's somebody we can remember as a real American person to admire and maybe draw on for the future when we look to how we deal with new problems. So that's my piece for today. But I also want to introduce our wonderful colleagues who will talk to us really from their rich experience on peacekeeper training. So first off, we have. And I'm always bad at reading these announcements, so just bear with me. We have William Shatawi, and she is a senior program officer that leads USIP's conflict management training for peacekeepers program. Prior to focusing on peacekeeper training, William focused on the intersection between education and training management and security sector reform. Before joining USIP, William assisted on and contributed to policy analysis and research projects led by the Oxford Criminology Center, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the United Nations Security Sector Reform Unit, and the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, covering socioeconomic and SSR issues in North Africa and other regions. William holds a master's in public policy from Oxford University, where she explored the notions and practices of democratic policing. William has had a rich background and has taught and trained for a long time. She's a true expert in her field, and we're so happy to have her in this conversation. Ms. Claudia Croce heads the pre-deployment training and advisory team within the Division for Peace at the United Nations Institute for Training and Research. She's assisting member states, international and regional organizations, and other relevant stakeholders as they contribute to lasting peace and security. She has over 15 years of experience in capacity building, supporting individuals, organizations, institutions, and societies from a systemic perspective. She has been working with numerous troop contributing countries for deployment to major UN peace operations, too many to name, and with many different acronyms. So we will work on the acronyms as we go. We'll introduce them once like we're writing, but it includes MINUSMA, MINUSCA, MINUSCO, UNMISS, and many others, including AMISOM I see here. Prior to joining Unitar, Ms. Croce worked for the UN OCHA, the Office of Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, the African Union, the OSCE, and NATO. Claudia holds a PhD in human rights, politics, and sustainability with a specialization on human rights and international humanitarian law. Welcome to USIP, Claudia. And finally, Yaro Hamadou. He's one of USIP's peacekeeper trainers. Mr. Hamadou is a retired gendarme from Burkina Faso. He is a former peacekeeper and a current peacekeeper trainer, trained by and now delivering training with the USIP in their conflict management training for peacekeepers program, CMTP, we call it. Yaro has served in Burkina Faso's national gendarmerie in various positions and has had responsibilities such as training peacekeepers. He's worked with battalions, foreign police units, and U.S. police advisors from Burkina Faso. He's been deployed to various UN and AU missions as a peacekeeper. Yaro served as a UN police officer and a peacekeeper in the field, as well as a best practices officer in charge of knowledge management, best practices, and lessons learned in the Office of the Police Commissioner within the United Nations African Mission in Darfur, Sudan. Yaro is now completing his master's degree in conflict, peace, and security and conflictology with Unitar. So welcome all of you to this wonderful discussion. I think that we should start off because William knows much more than I do about our own peacekeeping training, and so I will start with you to give just a brief overview before we start about the USIP's peacekeeper training and its history. And just before you get into the evolution and the details, could you just give us a little run through about our program?
Thank you, Andrew. USIP's training has gone through a wonderful period of growth and evolution over the years that is reflective, I think, of what pedagogical expertise has joined the team and has allowed this kind of content to grow, but also has kept up to date and abreast of evolutions in peacekeeping, mission realities, as well as how the UN and other institutions have reflectively looked at what is going on with peacekeeping mission effectiveness, how communities react to peacekeeping in general. I would start by saying that this program has been live and living at USIP since 2008. It has considerably changed from being a response to a need expressed to the U.S. government in its support to peacekeepers through the ACOTA program at the time, a need that was expressed that basically peacekeepers need tools to manage violence in non-violent way and to manage conflict in non-violent ways. And as the team grew and as USIP basically met more and more peacekeepers over time, this training has grown to become a much more direct and experiential training that is rooted in adult learning theory. And this is important for several reasons that I'll get into in a bit. And that really defines our approach. To begin with, as we met with peacekeepers and as the training was delivered, it has been very much an organic process of growth. It's not based singularly on core training materials that need to be followed. It very much takes its root from there, from the UN core training materials for peacekeepers, but it also is a reflection of the realities and the difficulties that peacekeepers and the communities that they are serving and protecting express. For example, when the protection of civilians mandate gained ground, it is incredibly important, and yet so many peacekeepers enter the training, the pre-deployment training, and leave it without a clear understanding of what it entails and what it implies. So what USIP's approach is to training is to turn that into a very real lived experience during the training before deployment, and that is through the development of extensive scenarios of very deeply well thought out interactions, of immersive learning experiences, and by building on the knowledge that a lot of these people bring into the classroom. It's based on the understanding that without digging deep into their own experiences of conflict, and this takes many forms in personal, professional, and conflict, war contexts, you cannot basically make the learning stick in a sense. And so when USIP carried out an assessment that started in 2014, and then a report came out in 2017, which I encourage people to read, it was a very important assessment that basically went to people and asked them what is missing, where are the gaps in peacekeeper training when it comes especially to a non-violent conflict management. We found that there was a huge issue in terms of how peacekeepers manage conflict, not only with the communities that generally face peacekeeping missions with some level of mistrust, especially now with disinformation being one of the biggest concerns that the UN is seeing in terms of how peacekeeping missions are regarded, but also in in the very structures of the peacekeeping troops, for example, their own internal structures, there have been issues with conflict management, is what we came to see. And so our training is meant to improve mission effectiveness, not just in terms of the relationship between the peacekeeper and the community members who have many grievances and issues that are legitimate and when dealing with peacekeepers, but also internally in the peacekeeping mission itself, how to manage conflict between troops, between the hierarchy of that entity that operates under such levels of stress and hostility in some cases. So that's the reality that we tried to handle, is how do you manage that conflict, and how do we make our training realistic? How do we make sure that we are not approaching it in a didactic manner? How do we make sure that when they come into the room, they are preparing for a real scenario and not just memorizing resolution texts, memorizing what is stipulated in a mandate in a theoretical manner. So that was the biggest part of how we defined our approach. The second part of it is the people that developed this program for USIP, and I can list a number of people, particularly amongst them are Alison Milovsky, Lana Lancaster, a number of different people who've worked on it over time. They made sure that they were bringing in experts from different fields. So it's very much rooted in specialization. So if we are to talk about gender and combating and preventing sexual exploitation and abuse, then that needs to be designed and developed with the right people. If we're talking about what mediation looks like, there are consultations with the right people who have that expertise. USIP's team that delivers the conflict management training for peacekeepers is actually a team that is based in the curriculum and training design team within USIP. And so these are expert curriculum designers and educational specialists. But the content is drawn from conversations with Unitar, conversations with specialists from the UN, conversations with experts in their own right in dealing with these concepts in conflict contexts. Finally, the conversations, perhaps the most important ones, are with peacekeepers themselves. Every year, USIP visits multiple lessons learned workshops that are actually encouraged and coordinated between the global peacekeeping operations initiative within the U.S. government and these peace and troop contributing countries, where they have their former battalions return, discuss lessons learned, discuss what has happened, and then define changes to curricula and changes to the pre-deployment training itself. And so the most important contributions have come from peacekeepers themselves, who have said this really was necessary, or that really didn't help me as much as I thought it would, or the way that I was trained on this didn't make sense in the actual context. And then there were conversations in our assessment, and you can find a lot of this information in the 2017 report that talks about that were coming from the communities themselves, from community members in peacekeeping contexts who felt that certain things, that certain skills were missing in peacekeepers. So it's been a learning process. It's been very much built on community engagement, on understanding what values peacekeepers need to have, what mindset shifts are required, keeping in mind that a 12-week pre-deployment training is, it's difficult to create that mindset shift from being a soldier in your own country to being a peacekeeper in a different context, and the difference in values that requires. So I hope that answers the questions. I would just finally touch on the key concepts or pillars of our training. And those are very much about making sure that the mission mandate is understood by the peacekeepers, that protection of civilians as a mandate is definitely understood. And maybe Yaro can share a little bit about what he faces when talking about protection of civilians with different peacekeepers. And then understanding power and what power dynamics exist when someone is a peacekeeper in a position of relative power compared to the community they're in. Understanding how that power operates and how they can use it for good and not for exploitation, or any kind of dynamic that ends up harming the peacekeeping mission and the community. Of course, understanding why communication is important. Different tools of conflict analysis are provided to the peacekeepers, and then there is, of course, a huge focus on sexual exploitation and abuse embedded into that broader conversation about power and gender and socialization. I will stop there, and I hope that perhaps the other extremely experienced colleagues can share more, and I also look forward to questions.
Thank you so much, William. And Claudia, before I turn to you, let me apologize deeply, because this is a co-hosted event with Unitar, the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, as I understand. So I should have explained that and given you the floor to open as a co-host and as a participant in your own right. But I think I have credit with Unitar. I was a champion of Unitar in the UN for many, many years. So I continue to sing the praises of Unitar. So please tell us about Unitar and how peacekeeping training connects to your broader mission as an organization or an institution within the UN. Over to you, Claudia.
Thank you, Andrew. And really, no worries. Protocol is not my strength. So, I didn't even notice it. So, thank you for having us in this panel discussion. And thank you, William, for introducing the program. Which, I will go into that in a second. I see so many similarities between what you are doing and what we are doing. But in general, I think it's reassuring as well, because it's very much the direction that the United Nations in general and the institutions that are supporting troop and other contributing countries are taking. So that's, in a way, is reassuring. But I will go into a bit the evolution and how what we do a little bit more. Before that, I take any opportunity to share a little bit more about Unitar, which is now probably the most known agency of the United Nations. But we do quite some work together with other UN agencies that is probably worth mentioning. So we do exist since 1965, actually, even before the United Nations Development Program. And we have been created at that time very much to support new member states that were gaining independence after the decolonization program, and really creating local capacities for them to enter into the international scene, not only at the level of the United Nations, but also regional organizations, but even just to reconstruct their institutions at the national level. So it has been a long path through the years. And of course, from 1965 to today, the world has evolved in a million of different ways. So our mandate has also evolved. What has remained very much at the core of our work is this idea of being a direct support for member states. So this doesn't mean we do not work with other UN agencies, partner organizations, but the core really of the work is supporting member states. And that's where the involvement with the peacekeeping training is really relevant, and this is where it came in. So as the member states were evolving and their contribution to the international peace and security system evolved as well, there was these realizations that many of these emerging countries were going to be very much involved in peacekeeping processes. And from there, from their experience working with our agency in other domains, that's from where the idea of creating a dedicated peacekeeping training program came about. So it was a long process, and it has evolved along with the evolution of peacekeeping, I would say. So you mentioned the first missions back in the days, and we know how much has changed. But this idea of really supporting the member states prior to their deployment, that's very much at the core of everything we do. And this comes with training, but also comes with other type of interventions that has evolved, again, along with the evolution of peacekeeping. So initially, our peacekeeping training program was very much focused on what were the traditional task of peacekeeping. So I would not say that peacekeeping has ever been an easy endeavor, because it's always about intervening into another country, of course, upon invitation. But through the years, and we have made reference to the evolution of mandates, the inclusion of the protection of civilians, clearly like the tasks that the Peacekeeper have been asked to face and to the roles that they have been asked to take on has evolved significantly. And at the same time, our training approach has evolved significantly along the way. So on the one hand, what we have seen is very much along with the increased complexity of mandates and expansion of our curriculums. Of course, as the United Nations, we are very much concerned about ensuring the harmonization and standardization of the curriculum according to UN standards. So there is a core pre-deployment training package that is being used for pre-deployment training, which goes hand in hand with specialized training packages depending on what component of the Army. In our case, we train police and corrections as well. So depending on which components we train, we look into this specialized material as well. So there has been this evolution, but also like this expansion, of the curriculum, but also like there has been this strong interest throughout the expansion to look into where the expertise to ensure this expansion can come from. And so the partnership with relevant institutions, where for us it was really, really essential to ensure us providing a product that can actually impact on the performance of the personnel once they are deployed. One thing that is important to mention about Unitar is that we are not mandated to set training standards. So we are not, of course, we do understand what we train our participants on, but we are not mandated to set the standards for the training. These for us come from the United Nations. And when the standards are not available, we do rely on international experts, the same way the process that you have been explaining. It's never something that is just being developed for the sake of developing something. And for us, what is really like the starting point, and that was the starting point when we reconsidered like our peacekeeping training program, was if we look at the task that the peacekeepers are assigned once they are deployed, how do we translate those tasks into training actually, so that the training is directly linked to the experiences that they will live once they are deployed. So for us, very much in this, with the evolution of the peacekeeping mission, the concern was really like giving peacekeeper the practical tools to actually operate and to make a difference once deployed. It's not about theory. It's not about knowing the resolutions. Of course, you should understand on which basis you are deployed in a country. That's essential. Of course, it's important that you understand what is the framework, what is that you can do and you cannot do. But how does this translate into your day-to-day work? That was for us very much the focus of everything that we have been doing. And so this idea of impacting on the performance has been, especially in the last year, with increased complexity, with everything that we hear coming from the field, this focus on performance has been our guiding star. Is really how can we support peacekeepers that are deployed in these situations to actually perform efficiently and effectively, understanding that if you look at the rates of fatalities in the field as well, we are really, if we are not doing our job correctly, we are really in a position to potentially put at risk the lives of the people that are being deployed. And that's a message that we have been passing very, very strongly to our trainers, which is another component of the work that we have been doing. So on the one hand, expanding the curriculum, including really all the possible topics that would allow the personnel to perform once deployed. So creating this strong linkage between training and the reality. What we have said, like I wrote it down, creating this lived experience prior to deployment. We sometimes even say there is no pre-deployment and deployment. You come to the training, that's when your deployment starts. So it's really like creating this linkage. But the other, we realize that for them to understand the field, for them to understand what they're going to face, we need to give them the opportunity to interact, to be trained by people that have the same experience, that have seen it, that have lived it, that know what it means. And so that has been very much the focus we have been giving into the selection of the trainers. So making sure that the trainers have the field experience, they do have an understanding of the UN system, potentially of other organizations as well, that they can create this connection with the participants and that they have done what they are training on. So that has been really a mantra. You don't train unless you know to do it yourself, unless you know how to do it yourself. That has been very much a mantra for us and a crucial element. The third way our program has expanded over the years on the methodological approaches. So we have realized, and again, we have made reference to this, to create these lived experiences prior to the deployment, prior to hitting the field. You really need to use very alternative approaches to training to what we have seen before. We work with adults. We work with people that have been trained in security and defense forces, where training is very often conceived in a very direct and instructor-led fashion, which is not always the best solution. Of course, in some cases, you need to have that approach, but in some other cases, you really need to try to have a stronger mix of experiences. So we have been really through a dedicated team that we have in Unitar, which is for learning solutions, really devising these solutions for training to make sure that when people come to the training, it's not just about sitting in a classroom and listening to someone or looking at the PowerPoint, with all respect for that, but it's really being engaged. So to the point that then the knowledge and the skills that we are transferring are retained parties. So a lot of work has been done in this direction. And the last dimension that we have very much explored in this evolution is realizing that we talk a lot about training, but training is a component of capacity building. And when you look at capacity building entails a lot of different things. If you want, and that's what we want, to change the behavior, so impacting on this performance, you have to look at many different dimensions. Starting from, does the personnel have the appropriate equipment? Is the personnel trained with their infrastructures? Has the institution have the proper procedures and operating standards for the personnel to be deployed? So on the basis of this acknowledgement that really capacity building is something broader that can encompass different dimensions, we have really besides training, taking on different types of interventions. So from provision of equipment that it's always in line with the UN standards and the standards that are set at the secretariat level, provision of equipment, support with infrastructure, but also a lot of what we have been doing lately is institutional support, is really advising and working with institutions, security institutions, for them to be ready to deploy the appropriate and well-prepared personnel in the field. And what we have seen, I know it's not the topic of the session today, but one of the elements that we have seen this particularly important into is when we want to include gender equality and equal participation of men and women in peace operations. Unless we really work with institutions, unless we look at infrastructure, unless we look at equipment, just the provision of training is not sufficient. You have really to take a much more comprehensive look into that. So probably this can be the topic for another panel discussion, but that's to give you a sense a little bit of the evolution of the program. So really from something that was very traditional at the beginning to the recognition of the increased complexity, the increased risk. I mean, the Cruz report was a milestone, I think, for anyone that works in peacekeeping to acknowledge really, okay, it's no longer only about creating an impact or not. We are talking about the life of people. So how can we make sure they are prepared for that? And what is entailed for that preparation? So we have really looking into all these different dimensions and trying to integrate them in a way or another with the different member states we support, understanding that probably the mandate of Unitar allows us to have a broader and more comprehensive engagement with member states, which is what I was saying at the beginning, really the core of everything we do. So I think I will stop here, but happy to answer again any question that will come up later.
Thank you so much, Claudia. Thank you so much for that sort of introduction and description of the evolution. What strikes me from your comments and from what Guido was saying is beyond and broadening the scope of just program planning writ large in peace building. There's a lot of conversations that I've had recently about what the U.S. Army War College deemed the VUCA world, which stands for a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world that we all find ourselves in, and meeting those challenges seems to be ever more difficult, and we must adapt our training in all these contexts of peacekeeping and peace building more broadly, which is perfect to turn to Yaro, who's really our practitioner and trainer here, and we're so happy to have you. I just want to ask you two questions, Yaro, to start off. I mean, could you start off by telling us about the primary difficulties that you faced as a peacekeeper, and seeing how you try to tackle those with future peacekeepers as you do your training? And then secondly, could you talk to me about the sort of the perspectives and attitudes of your trainees versus yourself when you were yourself a trainee, and your colleagues when you were going into training? Have you seen differences over time in the training sort of environment and perspectives? So if you could just open with those two questions, it would be great to hear from you, Yaro.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, everyone, and thank you for having me. I'll start by trying to answer the second question as far as the attitude of the treaty peacekeepers is concerned. Saying that it's declaring to my experience, got the opportunity to work with the peacekeepers from my country, from 2007 to 2015, and then with international peace training, with international training peacekeepers with USIP. So I'm confident, and I'm very confident. I can personally say that I have observed some changes in training peacekeepers' attitude, and specifically the way they think and they act during the mission preparation, the deployment training and mission readiness. So you can really observe some positive changes, the positive changes in their attitude, because most of them, they are ready. They have a lot of knowledge about the mission, about the field of deployment, and the mandate. But compared to us, because when I was going for that mission, actually I have less information about where I was going for the mission, less information about the mandate, and less information about the specific parts of UN pool in that specific mission. So compared to now, when you are conducting training in the classroom, you can see you have a lot of experience within the training. That sometimes even they conduct the classroom and share experience among them, do the lessons that you have to conduct with them. So having this information about the field, the mission area, and the mission, it's a positive thing, it's a positive aspect. And I think all this is because of the training, the deployment training, provided by many providers like USIP, like Unitar, like Kofi Annan, and also national staff, because now you have national staff the two contributing countries that are now becoming trainers. So before even the trainees end up the deployment training and get ready to be deployed, they are really ready. They are really ready to go. And this is very good aspect. Very good aspect for them to succeed the mission, because they hit the ground confident and knowing what they have to do. And it's also a positive aspect for the mission effectiveness, because if you have staff and people that hit the ground and they are ready to go, so you don't spend lots of time in the deployment training, you don't spend lots of time teaching them before you deploy them on the ground. And this is a very good aspect of training that are very positive. Now, related to the difficulties of the challenges I personally face, I can list maybe just two challenges to difficulties, which is having less information about the mission field, less information about the mandate, less information about the task, the specific task before leaving my country and before hitting the mission ground. And the second one is actually distance from family. Yeah, it's distance from family, because mission area is mission area. You leave your family and then you have to stay maybe 6 to 12 months. So it's true that military, you usually separate with your family, but when you leave for the mission area, it's a very specific area. So that's two challenges, and usually I used to share the experience of how I overcome those two challenges with the trainees. And the first one is actually really when you hit the ground, if you are not likely to have enough deployment training, go to your website, go and read about your mission mandate, exploit any opportunity, and read to be ready. And also try to discuss with your colleagues. That's exactly what I did, and it worked. And for the family, you have to stay as much as you touch with your family. And sometimes, mission alone in the mission come back in developing countries. Soldiers need to consider it like a source of income, and they don't want to spend it. Even paying credit or in traveling when they have the opportunity to go home. I think this is not a good advice. Anytime you have an opportunity to travel and go back and see your family, anytime you can spend, you can buy credit and stay in touch with your family, do it as peacekeepers, because they are part of the mission actually. They are part of you, because they support you on the ground. So the morale is very good from the family. Yeah, and you always have them with you, you always succeed in your mission. And it's good, also very good for as I said, for the mission effectiveness. So, I don't know, I'm available, that's what I have to share. If there's any question, any clarification, I'm ready for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that experience. Yeah, it does strike me that the conditions of service, not like I said, I was only a short period, a few months in Somalia, but I was years in Libya and Iraq with the special political mission. So we didn't have peacekeepers, but we had the UN Guard unit, and they are from troop contributing countries, and they're guarding us, and they really had hard conditions of service with the long deployments and long times away from their family. And I think the thought was that they're military men and they should tough it out, but it was tough, and I know that keeping the morale up is really important. So yeah. I understand that. And it's good to hear that over the time you've seen a positive trajectory for the trainees, and that they've been better pre-deployment training, better informed. That's really a positive trend. William,
Andrew,
yes. Yes, sir.
I just want to, it's a very good example that you have given, and I also want to add something about the pre-deployment training, because just last month I was in Uganda conducting training for the battalion ready to go to Somalia, and then in one of my training assessment questions, what I have actually what you learned, what you didn't know, and what you know now. One of the female training peacekeepers told me that this is the first time actually for her, or this is the first time for her to hear that the POC, protection of civilians, is actually beyond physical protection. Because for her, for a long time, if they are talking about protection of civilians, it's only physical protection of civilians. So you see, getting this information before you get to be deployed is very good. It's very good. And it's not. Taking my own example, when I was, before I leave to my country, to Darfur, I didn't know that. I didn't know that. I actually knew it when I was on the ground. When I was ground, I went through mission training, and I get now more information about the POC mandate, which is Claudia said, which is the mission, because it's all the mandate. It's the heart of the all mission mandate. So
very interesting, and the mandates are very different. One mandate is very different from another, as we know, in the different missions. And William, I think that's a good point. As I turn to you, there's these concepts. Protection of civilians is one. They're embedded in international law. Some of these things are in international humanitarian law. Some of them are a part of the Security Council mandates, and they at an abstract level, to some, they make a lot of sense, but to a peacekeeper who has to go out into the field and live in the real world circumstances to abide by some of the principles or have to enact the mandate that's been written in an abstract way, it must be really hard for trainers to simulate and get people prepared. One of the probably more sensitive subjects, and especially with peacekeeping over time, and especially as we see, since the dawn of war, I think, unfortunately, is that conflict-related sexual violence has been, an atrocity of war for a long time. It's hopefully increasingly more recognized as such, but never ceases to occur more and more, as we see in Sudan today and around the world. How do you deal with training in conflict-related sexual violence and those issues for peacekeepers when doing these trainings, and then more broadly the gender aspects, as Yara was mentioning, a female peacekeeper, so both in the contingents are mixed, and then also, of course, dealing with communities and all of the gendered aspects of peacekeeping. How is that approached with your training, William?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Primarily, I'll start by saying that one of the benefits of the way that we've been doing the training is by training smaller groups rather than kind of whole battalions. But that's also, up until now, it's been a resource issue, and now we have been growing in a sustainability strategy of training more and more civilian trainers, and we are on the path to training instructors from these military troop contributing countries to increase the number of training classrooms, training basically spaces, so that we can maintain the small group but train bigger and bigger portions of the deployed battalion. The idea has been that we can't really talk about questions of sexual exploitation and abuse and questions of gender without first digging deep again into personal experiences and personal understanding, and having an introspective conversation about how we view gender, how we view others in general, as as people first before being peacekeepers. And then once we've had that conversation, and we have this through in-depth conversations about, where is the violence rooted? Aside from the power dynamic, where is it rooted? Where is that socialization and understanding of gender in these harmful ways that end up creating victims and survivors, hopefully in many cases, of assault? How do they form? We talk about social understanding of gender, about how these constructs are developed. We talk about poverty. We talk about exploitation. We talk about the profit motives. We talk about the general structures that together create these realities. And then once we've had those conversations, it becomes easier to explain the why and one's place in that dynamic, in that equation, either as a protector or as hopefully a thwarted aggressor, because the reality is peacekeepers have themselves been involved in sexual exploitation and abuse in many contexts. So it has been really interesting for us to observe peacekeepers say things like, okay, I had heard about zero tolerance policy in the UN. I had heard about the necessity to fight sexual exploitation and abuse, but I didn't know, and this is, a few weeks into their training, into the pre-deployment training, I didn't know that involved not sleeping with prostitutes during a mission. I didn't know that this involved not actively pursuing someone I found attractive from the community. That understanding of the power dynamic and the complexities of what UN zero tolerance policy dictates is difficult to achieve without literally, developing multiple scenarios that are very nuanced to help them understand even further what is and is not possible, and what may cause unintended harm. And these are very complex conversations. This is why it is, so important to have these forms of training that Claudia mentioned, where you do have that space, that ability to transition from instructor-led to participant-centered training contexts, because these are concepts that make the difference between someone actually being a victim of sexual abuse and assault or trafficking or other, and someone actually not experiencing this horrific reality. So the time and the dedication that we dedicate to these conversations, by rooting them in the personal, by rooting them in very nuanced conversations about power and about gender and about the socioeconomic conditions that lead to individuals perceiving others as inferior or as targets, are important and are we dedicate a lot of time to that. And I think that's what makes the difference between someone, just saying, oh yeah, UN zero tolerance, and someone who receives a 4 or 5 day training and says, I didn't know that it was that nuanced. I didn't know that there were degrees to this. And I didn't know that it's because I have been conditioned to see things in a certain way, to see others in a certain way. And I didn't know that I had power, because in many cases, and I've had the conversation with a peacekeeper about this in Malawi, they feel kind of as victims in many situations, right? The peacekeeper themselves feel that their conditions are not great. They are misunderstood by the community. There's a lot of misinformation about what they're doing there. People hate them. People are attacking them. There's protesters at the door. There's, so much that they could forget that at the end, when they look at things objectively, when they understand the power that they hold in that situation, that they still have the responsibility to recognize that in that power dynamic, they are the ones with the power. And so that's a lot of what the conversations end up revolving around, understanding their role as a peacekeeper. So that is how we approach this question. We try to really, really dig into the personal first. And the other thing that we, as I mentioned earlier briefly, like around sustainability, it is important for us to have former peacekeepers or just civilians from different countries that are contributing troops to be the main trainers. And that is the dynamic that we're in right now. The strategy is to ensure that these conversations are had between, people who understand the same experiences, who, when they talk about socialization, can talk about it in ways that are rooted in the local and personal contexts. And that is how the whole curriculum is designed to be a tool in a long-term sustainability process for troop contributing countries to really focus on the essential concepts and skills that they need for effective peacekeeping.
Thank you so much, William. And Claudia, I have another question for you, as you know, but I would like to see if you have any comments. You raised some of the gendered aspects before, but on the sexual exploitation and abuse, by peacekeepers, which unfortunately we know of, but also their work on trying to protect civilians from conflict-related sexual violence. If you have any comments, I know we don't have too much time, and we could dedicate many days to this topic. But any other comments you have to add, and then I have one other question, but I'll just open with that. Any comments you have to add, and then follow up.
Yeah, thank you. Well, yes, I think that William said it. We have to move away from the traditional, and that's probably a bit also like the challenge of the United Nations, because as I was saying, the United Nations has standard training packages, and these standard training packages are developed through a process that involved all 193 member states. Everyone has to agree. So you get to a point where the content is quite diluted and where you address some of the topics very much from a superficial level. However, if we really want to make the difference, and that's, I think, the realization of the United Nations, just having a session on sexual exploitation and abuse in which we say, this you cannot do it, this you cannot do it. I mean, people will be, and that's my experience as well when we train, and people will say, of course, Mom, I mean, I do know that I cannot do it. Is this the fact that I'm telling them you cannot do it, is this going to prevent them from doing? No. And that we see it like on a regular basis, unfortunately. What is important to understand is where this behavior is rooted. And as William was saying, like, this is a deep process that requires people really to put themselves somehow in question, to put like the things that they believe on, or they have been socialized accordingly, to put them in question and decide for themselves, is this something that I can accept or not? And really having this process of questioning is a process that takes time, and also is a process that requires a lot of sensitivities, because you are going to open up Pandora boxes. And the last thing you want to do is really like being perceived as someone that wants to brainwash them according to certain standards or whatsoever, which is always the risk when you get into these dynamics. So it's really like trying to understand where this behavior is rooted, but this is with all sorts of behavior. To change the behavior, you need to understand from where the behavior starts, and then going and working with that behavior. There are behaviors that are easier to work with, and there are behavior that are less easier to work with, because the impact on how I have been socialized, culture, religion, and many, many different things that can be very, very sensitive. But Yaro said something that I'm very I'm 150% supportive with, the important role that families play in deployment. And I'm really, really convinced of that, having experienced it myself, but also like having worked with so many peacekeepers, families, at the same way that we train the troops prior to deployment, there is a space, not probably to train the families, but to raise the awareness of the families. How can they support the people that are deployed? How they can really become part of the mission, as Yara was saying, which can make such a difference. Because if I know that even if they are not with me, but they are, and today, I mean, with technology, we are a phone call away from our loved one. Of course, it's not the physical presence. I do agree with that. but still, really, how can we sensitize them on the challenges that the people that are deployed will face? How can they support them, even if it's only from distance? How can they help recognizing if there are signs of distress, if there are signs of some traumatic events that are impacting on the mental health? And I mean, these also the United Nations is getting more and more aware of the importance. I mean, all the peacekeeping, a good part of the peacekeeping ministerial this year is going to talk about the importance of mental health for peacekeepers and how, like, who can support them in this process, and the discussion around families is one. And it would be really interesting from my perspective also, like in these more sensitive topics, really how to involve the families as well. Because at the end of the day, if we go back to the sexual exploitation and abuse, is the consequences of those acts are not only for the individual themselves, but something we insist on a lot. You're wearing a uniform, you represent the country, but at the same time, you're part of a community, you're part of a family, and everyone will be impacted by that. And so really, like, doing on the one hand this deep work on understanding where the behavior comes from, and really like going much more on a personal dimension, but also helping them understanding it's not only about that. Are you ready to lose everything for what you're about to do? Ask yourself the question before doing it. And then if the answer is yes, okay. I mean, I'm not saying go ahead, absolutely. But I mean, it's a different thing. But are you really ready to lose everything? Do you really realize at what point you will lose everything? And so really like, but having, again, this discussion requires, again, the involvement probably also of the families, and also really safe spaces where people feel comfortable discussing these topics, which are extremely uncomfortable topics, and not only for Peacekeeper, for anyone.
Absolutely. Thank you, Claudia. Out of interest of time, I'm just going to turn back to Yaro before we go to some questions from the audience here. But Yaro, I really want to hear from you about your experience. We've been talking about how it's a tough experience going off and deploying as a peacekeeper, and you mentioned how it is. We've talked about how it's different from the national service that many peacekeepers are coming from. But in your service in the gendarmerie in Burkina Faso, and then going off to be a peacekeeper, and now as a trainer, that sort of your own reflections from that experience, have they informed your training? And so could you tell us about how you felt? I mean, you've said the conditions of service, but what were the things you never imagined when going from being in the gendarmerie to becoming a peacekeeper, and how do you bring that into your training and to try to help future peacekeepers in their transition? I think you're muted. You're on mute.
All right. Thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you. Let us first talk about peacekeeping mission, because it's a very particular word or setting, and sometimes you just have to know what I'm talking about. You just have to live it and know it. I have one of my friends saying that a peacekeeping mission is a word within the word. Yeah. So it's a small word within the word. So it's an environment when you bring people, from different backgrounds. You bring military, police, and civilians from different countries, different cultures, different beliefs, different backgrounds. And in a very particular environment, the peacekeeping environment is a very particular environment. It's a conflict environment, it's a threatening environment, and you bring those people to help people that are also from different backgrounds, different stories. Because the warring parties, the vulnerable peoples, all of them have different beliefs, background, history. So you bring these people to work together for a very short time to give results. So it's a very particular setting, a particular story. And what really helped me, coming back to your questions, from national gendarme to peacekeepers, that was easy because I was training peacekeepers before I got deployed. Yeah. So when I got on the ground and I started learning, learning about the environment, the working environment, and then I was confident that to work in such environment, you need rules, you need some values. You need some regulation when dealing with all this. So basically, you have to base on some values like integrity, respect for diversity and gender, and professionalism, as UN stated. Integrity, you have to be it, you have to live it, you have to act accordingly. So professionalism, you have to live it, you have to act it, and you have to do it. And mostly about diversity and respect for diversity, respect for gender and diversity, because you are in that world, in this world, actually, if you are in the peacekeeping mission. So those values really, and you have to, they are requirements, they are must. From my country to the peacekeeping mission and now for training as a trainer with USIP. So
we lost your audio again. It doesn't look like you're muted, but we can't hear you. I'll give you a second. We'll come back to you, Yara, to finish up if you can't pick it up. But we're running out of time, and I want to get to some of the questions here from the audience. So we lost Yara, unfortunately. Maybe we'll get him back in just a second. So I'm just turning to some of our questions here. The first one. Sorry, I'm picking between two. Okay, the first question is about the employment of peacekeeping intelligence as an essential element for peacekeepers to remain safe. The question is, how are peacekeepers and force commanders trained prior to deployment in gathering and utilizing intelligence? And I think we know that some of these missions have these JMACs and these joint centers for gathering all of the different intelligence. It's not intelligence, as my understanding is, in the way we think of national intelligence services, but it is its own form of gathering data, compiling it, and distributing it to the mission. But that's I shouldn't have answered the question. Maybe I'll turn to Claudia or Yara. Yara might not have heard it. First to Claudia, because you heard the question, and then Yara, if you have anything to add. The question is how peacekeepers receive and deploy the intelligence that they need for their work.
Yeah. So since last year, actually, there is now a full training packages on peacekeeping intelligence. So that's something that the United Nations recognizes as an essential tool. As you said, it's not intelligence in the sense that we conceive it, for example, at the national level, national defense forces and so on, but it's still very much around the collection of information and the analysis of the information for operational purposes. So not only personnel that has this specific role within the unit is being trained, but also the commanding officers are being trained, because those that have the specific role most of the time are very much in the collection analysis part, but then the commanders needs to know how to use those informations to plan, command, and guide the executions of operations. So it's all formalized at the level of the military, and it's being formalized for the police as well. So it's definitely like an acknowledgement that this is relevant, and is linked then to all the support structures that you have within the mission as well.
Thank you. Yara, do you have anything to add in your experience for the need for intelligence, the training that you may have received, or any training that you're doing on intelligence for peacekeepers?
Not really, but within the battalion, I think they do have they do deploy human intelligence. Not they do have human intelligence personnel within the battalions. Going with patrol team in the fields. So they always join the patrol team because, Andrew, what I'm talking about, UN mission is all about interaction. It's about interaction, communication, and talking. So usually we have those intelligent people within the battalion and joining patrol team, collecting informations, or collecting intelligence from previous, because usually you have the same country deployed within the same area for many times. So they do share the intelligence and information within the battalion to help their work. And this is what I know, and this is how we train them when we train the battalion in the country. All right, thanks.
Thank you so much. And I think we only have time for one more question. I want you all to try to respond to and go around. I'm going to start with William, because the audience question, I think, is something that might be on everyone's mind who would tune into such a conversation. I mean, we know about some of the problems we're seeing in missions, specifically the peacekeeping mission in Mali, or the issues with the and even in the Central African Republic with Wagner there, and the different narratives around the mission, and the calls for the mission to leave, both from the government, but I also think amongst the population we've seen protests. So the question is, having seen the high profile instances of civilian protests against missions, they mentioned in Mali and also MONUSCO in the DRC, and the public hostility that we've seen, and it's definitely the case in the DRC, as we know. What more can be done? We've talked about it over the course of this conversation, but how can UN missions train peacekeepers to be more responsive and more equipped to deal with the demands of the civilians for accountability? Yes, we've talked about that, but also effectiveness. What can be done, especially in the face of these more transactional alternatives that are out there, that are often appealing to governments. I once spoke to an interlocutor who country to remain nameless, but they liked Wagner because Wagner fights and Wagner kills the bad guy, but we also know what comes along with the package. That's the government perspective. That's not what this question is about, but there is that competition there. That is that threat to the peacekeeping missions. So I think, William, we'll start with you. What can be done in the face of these high-profile issues, and what training can be done to prepare peacekeepers to respond to these issues? And I'm going to give this question to everyone.
Thank you, Andrew. I would say that at its core, this question is about how peacekeepers and communities perceive each other and how they operate together with each other. The primary issue that we see is based on what are the expectations from the peacekeeping mission and how they're communicated to civilians and to people in general in the country. If the expectation is for the peacekeeping mission to resolve problems that are outside of its, or that are beyond its capacity, that creates an issue with trust. So first of all, managing expectations is essential, and communication targeted communication about that is essential. We've seen peacekeepers return and say that the community expected us to deal with everything and to be the ones who respond to every issue, medical supplies, food, access to transportation, dealing with infrastructure, fighting the people that they perceive as a threat and the cause of violence, resolving issues around, political, so the expectations are diverse, and managing those expectations, I think, from the UN peacekeeping force itself at its leadership level, but also equipping every single individual on that peacekeeping mission. I really think it's every single person, including people who do non-troop, non-military work, including people who do non-police work. Everybody needs to know exactly what the talking points are around the mission's goals and what it can reasonably achieve in that moment. Second of all, really beefing up the efforts like the ones that USIP and Claudia's team and Unitar do, things that really revolve around tools for conflict analysis, tools for managing that conflict through mediation and collaborative problem solving. The biggest issue is that if you have a community that feels like the peacekeepers just close the gate if it gets too rough, or pull out the guns, which thankfully peacekeeping missions are not always putting violence first, but that is something that is necessary, giving them those tools, to equipping them with how to negotiate, how to mediate, how to resolve an issue without resorting to violence. And that is, we're trying to do it, but what I'm trying to say is more, because to be perfectly honest, the full battalion is not receiving this training yet. And expanding our pool of trainers through our current TOT process, and I'm sure that Unitar is also involved in a lot of TOT processes, this is going to help us reach more and more of people on that peacekeeping mission, to be able to communicate the talking points, to be able to communicate reasonably, to be able to manage expectations, and to be able to say when they can and what they can and can't do in a way that doesn't aggravate the issue. And finally, last point is just around, so much right now that the UN is going to be talking about more in depth, I'm sure, is misinformation and how to combat that through the technologies that we have. And I think the last resort is obviously violence, and these are very concrete ways that we can work on that.
Thank you so much, William. And Claudia, what are your thoughts?
Yeah.
You're on mute.
Sorry. My thoughts are very much along the way of what William was saying. I mean, when you ask the question, the first answer for me is management of expectations. And that's, I would take it probably not only at the individual level, but that's a systemic problem at the UN level. So even the UN, absolutely, like when the people are deployed, absolutely they do have a responsibility to manage the expectations of the communities. But at the same time, we need to align the discourses as well. You cannot have at the strategic level a certain discourse that then is not much with what's happening on the field. So I think that managing expectations at all levels from a strategic perspective, but also then when you go down to the community is essential. The issue of misinformation is another big thing. And you have to understand also that you are intervening in context where you have different power dynamics, different interests, and the reason for misinformation may be multiple. And so also like being aware of that and understanding that part. But the other big thing for me, like really to avoid these issues, is accountability. We need to strengthen our accountability mechanism as United Nations. It's not only like if something doesn't go in the right direction, I think that we need to really pause for a second and try to understand, okay, why this is gone so wrong, and what is that we're going to do to correct this, and showing to the communities that there is an accountability system. If something goes wrong, it's not just to say, oh, sorry, something went wrong, we will continue, but showing that there are consequences, that people are held accountable. That will be really, really important to avoid these situations that we have seen. You have mentioned Mali. I'm very, very familiar with the context in Mali. And one of the big issues there that has fostered this confrontation of the civilian communities vis-a-vis the mission is around accountability. There are things that happen, incidents that happen, and people that lose their lives for whatever reason. At least stop for a moment, try to understand why this has happened. And if there was a mistake, acknowledge there was a mistake. We are humans, we can do mistakes, but acknowledge it, have people accountable for it. And that for sure helps in the trusting process. If I know that I can do wrong and nothing will happen, I mean, why then someone should just go along the way? That doesn't make any sense. We would not do it as individuals. I wonder why we should expect communities where we intervene, where we are like hosted, but where we are hosted by should accept it. So for me, this management expectation, misinformation, but also accountability are really important elements.
And Yara, I'm going to close with you, but the same issue of responding to the protests and dealing with these protests. But there's a long question, and they've asked for any examples on the African continent specifically of when there's been successful training to prepare to respond to civilian needs. And I just want to ask your thoughts. Potentially on the more involvement of regional bodies in peacekeeping. We've seen that in Mozambique today. It's not a UN mission; it's a SADC mission. And you've spoken to the experiences of peacekeepers going back to their countries and being able to train. So actually, African-led, regionally focused peacekeeping missions and the training of those peacekeepers. Can you comment on maybe that dimension and see if that would have any means of sort of responding to these protests and these demands and your thoughts on that, Yara?
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. And coming back to what Claudia had said is for the first point, which is all about expectation and political trends in the mission area, which has to be dealt at the international level, at the high level, the strategic level. But for the peacekeeper, as peacekeeper on the fields, you have to stick on the mandate and be useful for the people you are serving on the ground. So we have to train peacekeepers to stick on the mission mandate and deliver what they have to deliver on the ground. And vulnerable people, the population has to see that they are useful for them. Then they can influence what is happening in the country. So that's how we have to actually to train the peacekeepers to be very careful about the political trend within the mission environment. Yeah, you are a peacekeeper on the fields. You have to be very careful what is happening in the field as far as the politics issue is concerned, and so on. So coming back to your question about shifting from UN to African peacekeeping dimensions, yes, I think it's what is happening. What's happened first in Darfur, the UN start mixing hybrid missions, and then Somalia hybrid missions. And yes, it's good trend if we have like West African countries, like here in West Africa, if UN can push our local organization to be very supportive to the peacekeeping missions operating within the region. That will be very good. But that will bring a positive asset because we have a lot of peacekeepers, a lot of experience. So that will be very good, because one of the challenge of the UN is you bring in people from all over. UN doesn't have any forces. So if you have to mobilize maybe people at the regional level, that will be very easy. And then follow the local, the regional or organization to implement that. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Yara. Yeah, that was my observation. I was in Nairobi last week and speaking about some with IGAD, even here in Washington earlier this week. This seems to be the involvement of the regional economic communities in peace and security, peacekeeping specifically, seems to be a trend. And in Mozambique, when I spoke to members of the Southern African Development Community Mission in Mozambique and the civilians that were working with them and sort of receiving aid from them in Cabo Delgado, it seemed to be a positive trend for now. So that dimension seems to be something positive. It's a little bit off the training topic, I'm sorry, but of course there's training that has to go with that. Thank you so much. Oh, William has one last point, and then we have to close.
Yeah, just a very quick one. As we talk about evolution, I just wanted to do a little nod make a little nod to the future. And with the regional entities and, the realities that we're seeing on the African continent is that more and more regional groupings will have to develop to respond not necessarily to human threats, but to environmental threats. And so I would say that one of the big training elements that are going to be more and more in need as we go forward are how do peacekeeping missions deploy and respond to conflicts that result from environmental crises and challenges. And that's where the regional is going to be essential, because at that moment in the near future, there will be a response that is required, that is local and national and regional, as people will be displaced and moving around because of these issues. So that's just a nod to the future, but I'm hoping that, Andrew, maybe you can convene us again in the future to talk about future needs of peacekeeping on the continent and abroad as well, and all over the world where peacekeeping missions exist. Thank you.
I would be honored to do that. I think it is the future, and it is now. Unfortunately, we're facing these environmental disasters. Yara, did you have some last words? Yara, to close us out, anything you have to say?
No, I'm good.
Okay, Claudia. Okay, Claudia, any final words?
No, I think that the beauty of these conversations is that it actually opens up so many opportunities for follow-up conversations. And I think that looking into the future, it's definitely what is needed. And I mean, as you said, probably the future is now already. So how can we really be more proactive along that way? But I think that's a subject for another time.
Yes, unfortunately, we've run out of time and we didn't get to all the questions. I apologize to our, I'm sure, massive audience here. Thank you very much. And we'll talk to you later on. Thank you.